74,000 years ago, if you were born as a human, you probably wouldn't survive. Let that sit for a moment. At one point, our entire species may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals. Not thousands of communities, not thousands of villages. A few thousand people, total, everywhere on Earth combined. And that wasn't the only time. Again and again, humans faced moments where survival was not guaranteed. Moments where entire populations disappeared without a trace. Where the climate turned hostile, the food vanished, and the world itself seemed determined to erase us. We were almost wiped out, not once but repeatedly. Our ancestors barely survived. They clung to existence in small, scattered bands, dangerously close to extinction. One bad season, one failed hunt, one disease rippling through a tiny group. Any of these could have ended everything. Every person alive today carries the genetic memory of those bottlenecks. Every civilization, every language, every song, every child born this morning exists because a handful of desperate people refused to disappear. This isn't the story of how humans conquered the world. It's the story of how we almost didn't make it. Let us go back. Far back. Before the catastrophe. Before the ash and the cold and the dying. Let us visit a world where early humans were just beginning to find their footing on a planet that did not yet feel dangerous. Around 100,000 years ago, the world looked nothing like it does today. The continents were in roughly the same positions, yes, but the coastlines were different. Sea levels shifted with the ice ages. Vast grasslands stretched where deserts now sit. Africa was the center of everything. Not because anyone had decided it would be, but because that is where humanity was born. Our earliest ancestors had been evolving there for millions of years. By this point, Homo sapiens had existed for perhaps 200,000 years. But existing is not the same as thriving. Early humans were not the dominant species on the planet. Far from it. They were one of many hominin species walking the earth. Neanderthals inhabited Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans lived in the East. Other archaic humans lingered in scattered pockets. Our ancestors were relatively few in number. Estimates suggest that the total population of Homo sapiens at this time may have been somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 individuals, spread across the African continent. That sounds like a lot until you consider the scale. Africa is enormous. Over 30 million square kilometers. Scatter 200,000 people across that landmass, and you begin to understand how isolated these groups were. Many bands of humans may have never encountered another group in their entire lives. They lived in small communities, perhaps 20 to 50 people in a band. They hunted. They gathered. They followed the rains and the herds. Their tools were simple but effective. Stone blades, wooden spears, fire, which they had mastered long ago. These were not primitive people. Their brains were the same size as ours. They observed the stars, understood the seasons, and communicated in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. Some researchers believe that complex language was already developing during this period. Along the southern coast of Africa, small groups of humans were doing something remarkable. They were harvesting shellfish from tidal pools. They were using ochre pigment, perhaps for decoration or ritual. They were making beads from small shells. These behaviors suggest symbolic thinking, abstract thought, the beginnings of culture. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found engraved pieces of ochre dating to around 77,000 years ago. Geometric patterns carved deliberately into stone. Someone sat there and created art. At Pinnacle Point, also in South Africa, evidence shows humans exploiting marine resources as early as 164,000 years ago. These coastal dwellers had learned something critical. The sea could feed them when the land could not. This would matter more than anyone could have known. Because while these small communities were quietly developing the seeds of human culture, the planet was not stable. The climate oscillated between warm periods and cold snaps. Ice sheets advanced and retreated in the northern hemisphere. Droughts gripped Africa with increasing frequency. The environment was testing humanity long before the great catastrophe arrived. Fossil and genetic evidence suggests that human populations rose and fell repeatedly during this era. Groups expanded during favorable conditions, then contracted sharply when the climate turned hostile. Imagine living through one of those contractions. Your water source dries up. The animals you hunt migrate to regions you cannot reach. The plants you gather wither. Your children grow thin. Your elders die first. Then the young. You would not have understood why. You would have only known that the world was becoming harder. That survival required moving, adapting, or accepting the unthinkable. Some groups did move. Genetic evidence tells us that small bands of humans began venturing out of Africa well before the major migration events. Perhaps as early as 120,000 years ago, humans reached the Levant, the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. But these early migrations mostly failed. The populations that left Africa during these early waves appear to have died out or been absorbed. The world outside Africa was occupied by other hominins, and the climate was unforgiving to newcomers. So most of humanity remained in Africa, clustered in favorable regions, near water, near coasts, in valleys where game was plentiful. They did not know they were confined. They simply lived where living was possible. And for a time, that was enough. The generations passed slowly. Knowledge was transmitted through observation, through storytelling around fires that burned in the African night. Elders taught children which routes were safe, which animals were dangerous, which paths led to water. These were people of extraordinary resilience. They had already survived ice ages, droughts, predators, and disease. They had watched other hominin species come and go. They had endured things we cannot fully imagine, and yet they persisted. They carried forward, but they were fragile in ways they could not see. Their populations were small. Their genetic diversity, while greater than what would come later, was still limited compared to other species. A single catastrophic event could shatter everything they had built. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, on an island that would one day be called Sumatra, pressure was building. Magma was rising through cracks in the crust. A chamber of unimaginable power was filling, expanding, preparing to unleash something the world had not seen in millions of years. The humans going about their quiet lives in Africa had no way of knowing what was coming, no way to prepare, no way to understand that the ground beneath a distant island was about to change the fate of every living thing on the planet. They woke each morning. They fed their children. They watched the sun cross the sky. They told stories. They laughed. They grieved their dead. They were fully human in every way that matters. And they had no idea that they were living in the final calm before the worst storm our species would ever face. The world was about to break. Everything they knew was about to be tested. Not by a predator, not by a rival group, not by disease, but by the Earth itself. The planet that had given them life was preparing to nearly take it all back. Hold that image. Those quiet people on a quiet coast, watching the tide come in, unaware that somewhere across the ocean, the ground was beginning to tremble. Because what happened next would bring humanity closer to extinction than we have ever been, before or since. And the ones who survived would carry the scars in their very DNA, passed down through every generation, all the way to you. You are here because they held on. But to understand what they held on through, we need to talk about the day the sky itself turned against us. Chapter 2. The day the sky turned against us. Approximately 74,000 years ago, something happened that would reshape the planet. It did not arrive as a war or a plague. It came from below, from deep within the earth, from a place no human eye had ever seen or ever would see. The island of Sumatra sits along the boundary of two tectonic plates. The Indo-Australian plate slides beneath the Eurasian plate in a process called subduction. This collision zone is one of the most geologically violent regions on Earth. It has been for millions of years. Deep beneath what is now Lake Toba, a massive magma chamber had been growing for hundreds of thousands of years. Molten rock accumulated under enormous pressure. Gases dissolved in the magma like carbonation in a sealed bottle, waiting for release. No one knows exactly what triggered the final eruption. Perhaps a shift in the tectonic plates. Perhaps the sheer pressure became too great. Perhaps a series of earthquakes fractured the rock above the chamber just enough. The cause does not matter as much as the consequence. When the eruption began, it was not like anything we have witnessed in recorded history. This was not Mount Vesuvius. This was not Krakatoa. This was not Mount St. Helens. Those eruptions, as devastating as they were minor compared to what Toba unleashed. Volcanologists classify eruptions using the volcanic explosivity index, a scale from 0 to 8. Mount St. Helens in 1980 was a 5. Krakatoa in 1883 was a 6. Toba was an 8. The maximum, a supereruption. The kind that happens perhaps once every 100,000 years. When the chamber ruptured, an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material was ejected into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens ejected about 1 cubic kilometer. Toba released nearly 3,000 times more material. The numbers almost lose meaning at that scale. The initial blast would have been beyond comprehension. A column of ash and gas shot into the stratosphere, reaching heights of perhaps 40 to 50 kilometers. The sound would have traveled across continents. The shock wave would have flattened forests for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour raced down the slopes of the volcano. Everything in their path was incinerated instantly. These flows covered the landscape for hundreds of kilometers, burying the terrain under meters of hot volcanic debris. The immediate destruction zone was enormous. But the eruption's true power lay not in what it destroyed on the ground. It lay in what it put into the sky. And the sky would carry that destruction around the entire world. Billions of tons of sulfur dioxide were injected into the stratosphere. This gas reacted with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols, tiny droplets that remained suspended high in the atmosphere. These aerosols reflected sunlight back into space before it could reach the Earth's surface. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within weeks, the amount of solar radiation reaching the ground began to drop. The skies darkened. Not completely, not into permanent night, but enough. Enough to lower temperatures. Enough to disrupt the delicate balance that sustains life. Ash fell across an area spanning thousands of kilometers. In parts of India, ash deposits from the Toba eruption have been found measuring up to 6 meters deep. 6 meters. Imagine standing in a field and watching ash accumulate higher than the roof of your home. Southeast Asia was buried. The Indian subcontinent was blanketed. Ash has been found in ocean sediment cores from the Arabian Sea, the South China Sea, and even as far as East Africa. The eruption left its fingerprint across an entire hemisphere. But ash on the ground, while devastating, was a temporary problem. Rain would eventually wash it away. Plants would eventually grow through it. The real catastrophe was happening above, in the stratosphere, where the sulfuric acid veil was thickening like a slow-closing curtain. Global temperatures began to fall. Estimates vary among researchers, but some models suggest average global temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In certain regions, particularly at higher latitudes, the cooling may have been even more severe, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees. This was volcanic winter, a phenomenon where volcanic emissions block enough sunlight to dramatically cool the planet. 3 to 5 degrees may not sound like much to us, adjusting our thermostats by a few clicks, but for a planet, it is enormous. A drop of just 1 or 2 degrees can shorten growing seasons, shift rainfall patterns, and push ecosystems past their tipping points. A drop of 5 degrees can transform habitable regions into wastelands. Forests die, grasslands wither. The animals that depend on them starve or migrate. And it did not end quickly. The volcanic winter may have lasted several years. Some researchers suggest the cooling effect persisted for a decade or more. The sulfuric acid aerosols in the stratosphere have a residence time of 1 to 3 years, but Toba injected so much material that the effect compounded. Beyond the initial volcanic winter, many scientists believe Toba may have accelerated an existing trend toward glaciation. The eruption occurred during a period when the Earth was already in an ice age. The additional cooling may have pushed the planet into a more severe glacial phase. Ice sheets that were already extensive may have expanded further. Sea levels, already lower than today, may have dropped even more. The habitable zones on every continent shrank. For every species on Earth, the rules of survival suddenly changed. Think about what this meant for the plants. Photosynthesis requires sunlight. With the sky dimmed by volcanic aerosols, plant growth slowed dramatically. Forests thinned. Fruiting trees produced less. Grasses died back. The base of the food chain was under assault. The animals that ate those plants suffered next. Herbivores found less to eat. Their populations declined. And then the predators, including human hunters, found less prey. The cascade moved upward through every level of the food web with merciless efficiency. Water sources were affected too. Ash-contaminated rivers and lakes. Rainfall patterns shifted as the atmosphere adjusted to the new conditions. Some regions that had been reliably wet became dry. Others experienced unusual flooding. The predictability that all life depends on was shattered. For the humans alive at that time, scattered across Africa and perhaps a few outposts beyond, this was not an event they could name or understand. They did not know about volcanoes on distant islands. They did not understand atmospheric chemistry or global climate systems. They only knew that the sky had changed. The sun seemed weaker. The air felt colder. The rains did not come when they should have. The plants they depended on were not growing. The animals they hunted were harder to find. And their children were hungry. Every morning brought the same grim reality. The world had become hostile in ways that no amount of skill or courage could fully overcome. This was not an enemy you could fight. Not a drought you could wait out in a season. This was the world itself turning against you. And it was only the beginning. Because what the volcanic winter set in motion would not be measured in seasons. It would be measured in generations. The collapse that followed would push humanity to a place from which, by all reasonable expectations, we should never have returned. The sky had spoken, and what it said was nearly the end of everything. Chapter 3. Toba and the Collapse of Humanity. Now we arrive at the heart of the catastrophe. The eruption was the trigger. The volcanic winter was the weapon. But the true devastation was measured not in ash or temperature, but in people. In the slow, quiet disappearance of human life across the planet. This is the Toba catastrophe theory, first proposed by journalist Anne Gibbons in 1993 and later developed by Professor Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois. This theory suggests that the Toba supereruption caused a severe population bottleneck in the human species. A population bottleneck occurs when a species' numbers drop so dramatically that genetic diversity is permanently reduced. The survivors carry only a fraction of the genetic variation that existed before the catastrophe. Every future generation inherits that reduced diversity, like a book with most of its pages torn out. The genetic evidence is striking. Modern humans, all 8 billion of us, are remarkably similar at the genetic level. Far more similar than would be expected for a species as widespread and numerous as ours. We are more genetically alike than many populations of chimpanzees living in a single forest. This unusual genetic uniformity points to a bottleneck. Something, at some point, drastically reduced our numbers. And the timing aligns with Toba. Genetic analyses suggest that the effective breeding population of Homo sapiens may have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals around 70,000 years ago. Some estimates are even more extreme. Certain genetic models suggest the breeding population may have fallen to as few as 1,000 reproductive adults. Not 1,000 people total, but 1,000 who successfully reproduced and passed their genes forward. The total population may have been somewhat larger, but still devastatingly small. Picture that. Somewhere between a few thousand and perhaps 15 or 20,000 humans alive on the entire planet, scattered in small, isolated groups, unable to communicate with one another across the vast distances that separated them. Each group facing the same desperate conditions alone. The volcanic winter would have made Africa, humanity's heartland, significantly less hospitable. The regions that had supported human populations for millennia suddenly could not sustain the same numbers. Food sources collapsed. Water became scarce or contaminated. The carrying capacity of the land simply plummeted. Groups that had been stable for generations began to shrink. The old and the very young died first, as they always do in famines. Then the adults weakened. Diseases that a healthy population could resist became lethal to malnourished bodies. Infections spread through weakened communities. Some bands simply vanished. A group of 30 people, struggling through a second or third year of failed rains and diminished game, might lose their children, then their elders, then their hunters. Eventually, the last few survivors, too weak to travel, too few to sustain a community, would simply disappear. This would have happened again and again, across the continent. Groups that had existed for thousands of years, carrying unique knowledge, unique traditions, unique genetic variations, simply ceased to exist. Their stories were never told. Their names were never recorded. They vanished as if they had never been. The isolation of surviving groups compounded the crisis. When populations become very small and isolated, they face additional genetic threats. Inbreeding becomes unavoidable. Harmful recessive traits that would normally be diluted in a larger population begin to surface. Birth defects increase. Fertility declines. This is called a genetic death spiral, and it has driven countless species to extinction throughout Earth's history. Once a population falls below a certain threshold, the genetic damage becomes self-reinforcing. Each generation is slightly less viable than the last, until the population can no longer sustain itself. Humanity was dangerously close to this threshold. Not every scientist fully accepts the Toba catastrophe theory. Some researchers argue that the evidence for a severe bottleneck is less clear-cut than initially proposed. They point to archaeological sites in Africa and India that show continued human habitation through the Toba period. These critics note that some populations may have been sheltered from the worst effects. Coastal communities with access to marine resources might have weathered the volcanic winter better than inland groups. Tropical regions near the equator might have experienced less severe cooling. In 2018, researchers found stone tools in South Africa, both above and below layers of Toba ash, suggesting that at least some human populations continued without major disruption. This does not disprove the bottleneck theory, but it suggests a picture may be more nuanced than a single catastrophic collapse. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Perhaps Toba did not instantly reduce humanity to a handful of survivors, but instead initiated a prolonged period of decline. The volcanic winter may have been the beginning of a crisis that played out over centuries, not years. The eruption may have pushed already vulnerable populations past their breaking points. Groups that were thriving may have merely survived. Groups that were surviving may have perished. The overall trajectory was downward. even if the decline was not as sudden or as uniform as the most dramatic versions of the theory suggest. What is not in dispute is that humanity went through a severe bottleneck at roughly this time. The genetic evidence for this is robust and has been confirmed by multiple independent studies. Something reduced our numbers to a perilously small level, and Toba remains the most compelling candidate. There is another layer to this catastrophe that deserves consideration. Humans were not the only hominins alive at this time. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans lived in Eastern Asia. Other archaic human species survived in various pockets across the Old World. The Toba eruption and its aftermath would have affected all of them. Some researchers have suggested that the volcanic winter may have contributed to the eventual extinction of these other human species, though the timeline is complex and other factors were certainly involved. But here is what makes our story remarkable. Of all the hominin species alive 74,000 years ago, only one survived to the present day. Only one made it through every bottleneck, every ice age, every catastrophe. And that species is us. The question is, how? How did a population of perhaps a few thousand frightened, starving, genetically imperiled primates survive a catastrophe that reshaped the entire planet? How did they hold on when every environmental indicator suggested they should have gone extinct? The answer lies not in strength or speed or any physical advantage. It lies in something far more subtle and far more powerful. It lies in the minds of the survivors, in their ability to cooperate, to adapt, to share knowledge, and to imagine a future worth fighting for. But survival was not guaranteed, not even close. And the world those survivors inherited was a shattered, hostile place where every single day was a battle against extinction. What was it like to live in that world? What was it like to be one of those few thousand remaining humans, carrying the weight of an entire species' future without even knowing it? That is where we must go next, into the broken world, into the lives of people who, by every measure, should not exist, and yet they did. Chapter 4. The survivors who shouldn't exist. Imagine waking up in this world. The sky is pale and hazy, the sun a dim circle behind a veil of volcanic dust that has lingered for years. The air is cold, colder than your grandparents ever described. The landscape around you is sparse, dry, and unforgiving. You are part of a band of perhaps 30 people, maybe fewer. You know every face. You have known them all your life. There are no strangers in your world because there is no one else. The nearest group of humans, if they still exist, is impossibly far away. Your band moves slowly across the land, following faint signs of life. A track in the dust, a patch of surviving vegetation, a trickle of water in a riverbed that used to flow strong. Everything is diminished. Everything is less than what the old stories say it once was. The elders talk about a time before the sky changed. A time when the rains came regularly, when the trees bore fruit in abundance, when herds of animals darkened the plains. You listen to these stories at night around a small fire, but they feel like myths. Your reality is hunger. Constant, grinding hunger. Not the sharp pangs of missing a single meal, but the deep, hollow ache of chronic malnutrition. Your body has adapted to scarcity. You are smaller than your ancestors were, thinner. Your bones will show the stress lines of deprivation for archaeologists to find thousands of years from now. The children are the most vulnerable. Many do not survive their first year. Those who do are lean and watchful, all beyond their years. They learn early that food is never guaranteed, that water must be carried carefully, that the world does not provide freely. Every member of your band has a role. The hunters track what little game remains. The gatherers know which roots and tubers still grow in the depleted soil. The elders carry the knowledge of where water can be found, which directions to travel when the seasons shift. But the seasons do not shift the way they should. The volcanic winter has disrupted the patterns that humans have relied on for thousands of generations. The wet season comes late or not at all. The dry season stretches on, cracking the earth, turning water holes to dust. Your band makes decisions collectively: where to go, when to move, how to divide the food. These decisions carry weight that is hard to comprehend from the comfort of the modern world. A wrong choice, moving in the wrong direction, staying too long in a depleted area, can mean death. And death is close. It is always close. You have buried friends, family, children. The rituals are simple but sincere. A body placed carefully in the earth. Ochre sprinkled on the skin, perhaps. Words spoken that we will never hear. Grief that echoes forward through millennia. Some bands did not make it. You know this not because you found their remains, but because the places where people once lived are empty now. Campsites along rivers where other groups used to gather are abandoned. The shells of their fires are cold. Their tracks have been erased by wind. The loneliness of this era is difficult to overstate. Human beings are social creatures. We are wired for connection, for community, for the comfort of knowing others exist. In the post-Toba world, that comfort was rare. Each surviving band was an island of humanity in an ocean of emptiness. Yet within these tiny groups, something extraordinary was happening. The pressure of near extinction was forging the very traits that would eventually allow humanity to conquer the planet. Cooperation became not just beneficial, but essential. Every individual mattered. Every skill was critical. Every life was irreplaceable. Language, already developing before the catastrophe, may have become more complex and more essential during this period. The need to share detailed information about scarce resources, to coordinate hunts, to teach children quickly and efficiently, would have placed enormous selective pressure on communication abilities. Toolmaking became more refined. When materials are scarce, you cannot afford waste. Every stone tool had to be crafted with precision. Every spear point had to work the first time. The post-Toba humans may have become better craftspeople specifically because they could not afford to be anything less. Social bonds tightened. In a group where losing even one member could threaten the survival of all, taking care of the sick, the injured, and the elderly was not just compassion. It was strategy. Their knowledge, their experience, their hands were all needed. Everyone counted. There is evidence that humans during this period developed more sophisticated ways of exploiting coastal resources. Shellfish, which require no hunting skill and are available even when terrestrial food sources collapse, may have been a critical lifeline. The coast may have saved humanity. Archaeological sites along the southern African coast show continuous or near-continuous occupation through the period of the Toba bottleneck. These coastal refugia, as scientists call them, may have been the places where humanity held on. Small strips of shore where the ocean provided what the land could not. Imagine a life centered on the tide pools. Each day you wade into the shallows, prying mussels and limpets from the rocks. You gather seaweed. You watch for fish trapped in shallow pools. It is not the abundant life your ancestors knew, but it is enough. Barely enough. These coastal survivors may have been among the direct ancestors of every human alive today. The genetic evidence suggests that the post-bottleneck expansion of humanity originated from a relatively small source population, possibly concentrated in eastern or southern Africa. The beach may be where we were reborn, but the crisis was far from over. Even after the volcanic winter began to fade, even after the sky slowly cleared and temperatures began to recover, the world remained in the grip of an ice age. The Toba eruption may have ended, but the cold persisted. The glacial conditions that dominated the planet between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago meant that large portions of the Earth remained uninhabitable for humans. Ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels were dramatically lower, exposing land bridges but also reducing coastal habitats. For the survivors, recovery was agonizingly slow. Populations grew, but not quickly. Each generation added a few more individuals, expanded the range slightly, reclaimed a little more territory. But setbacks were frequent. Local droughts, disease outbreaks, conflicts with predators or other groups could erase decades of slow growth. The genetic record tells us that human populations remain small and fragmented for thousands of years after the Toba event. Distinct genetic lineages began to diverge during this period, suggesting that separated groups evolved in isolation for extended periods before reconnecting. Think about what that means. For thousands of years, small bands of humans lived and died in their own tiny worlds, developing their own traditions, their own knowledge, their own subtle genetic variations. They were like seeds scattered across a scorched landscape, each one carrying the potential for a forest, but each one vulnerable to being crushed. And yet, something in these people refused to die. Call it resilience, call it stubbornness, call it the blind biological drive to reproduce. Whatever it was, it kept them going through conditions that would have extinguished most species. They adapted to new foods. They developed new tools. They found new places to live. Some researchers believe that the post-Toba period was when humanity developed what we might call behavioral modernity, the full suite of cognitive abilities that distinguish us from all other species: abstract thinking, planning for the future, symbolic communication, art, music, storytelling, the full expression of the human mind. If this is true, then the worst catastrophe in our history may have also been the crucible that forged who we are. The pressure of near extinction may have selected for exactly the traits that would eventually make humans the most successful species on the planet. But that success was still far in the future. In the immediate aftermath of Toba and for thousands of years beyond, survival was the only goal. Not progress, not civilization, not art or science or philosophy, just survival. One more day, one more season, one more generation. The survivors could not have known that they were laying the foundation for everything that would come after. They could not have imagined cities or writing or spacecraft. They knew only the immediate world, the cold ground beneath them, the dim sky above, the faces of the few people they loved. And the world was not done testing them, because even as they slowly recovered from the Toba catastrophe, even as populations inched upward and the worst of the volcanic winter faded, new threats were gathering. The Ice Age was deepening. New challenges waited beyond the familiar shores of Africa. Humanity was about to attempt something extraordinary and terrifying, something that would take them beyond the only home they had ever known, into lands populated by strange animals, harsh climates, and other species of humans who had no intention of welcoming newcomers. The survivors who should not have existed were about to become something more. They were about to become wanderers, explorers, colonizers of an entire planet. But first, they would have to survive what came next. And what came next would test them in ways that even the aftermath of Toba had not prepared them for. The cold was coming. A cold deeper and longer than anything they had yet endured. And in that cold, humanity would face its next great reckoning. Chapter 5. The Journey Out of Africa. They had survived the worst volcanic catastrophe in human history. They had endured years without summer, watched their numbers collapse to almost nothing, and somehow held on. But survival was not the same as living. And Africa, their cradle, was changing beneath their feet. The Toba bottleneck left humanity genetically impoverished. Fewer than 10,000 breeding adults remained. Scattered in isolated bands along coastlines and river valleys, they clung to existence. The volcanic winter had passed, but its aftermath lingered. Ecosystems were damaged. Animal populations had crashed. Recovery was painfully slow. And then the cold deepened. Not the volcanic cold. Something older. Something cyclical. The Pleistocene Ice Age had been grinding forward for over 2 million years, advancing and retreating in long pulses. Now it was advancing again. Glaciers crept southward across Europe and Asia. Sea levels dropped as water locked into ice. Africa did not freeze, but it dried. The Sahara expanded. Forests shrank. Grasslands turned to dust. Lakes that had sustained communities for generations began to evaporate. The corridors that once connected different regions of the continent started closing, one by one, like doors shutting in a burning building. The bands that had survived Toba now faced a new crisis. Their refugia was shrinking. The coastlines that had provided shellfish and marine resources were changing as sea level shifted. Inland water sources were becoming unreliable. The carrying capacity of the land was dropping, and the population, fragile as it was, felt the pressure. This is the context most people miss when they imagine early human migration. They picture adventurous explorers setting out to discover new worlds. Brave pioneers with curiosity in their hearts and determination in their eyes. That is a comfortable story. It is almost certainly wrong. Nobody left Africa because they wanted to. They left because staying meant dying. Migration was not exploration. It was evacuation. It was a slow, desperate retreat from conditions that were becoming impossible. One band at a time, one generation at a time, moving not towards something better, but away from something unbearable. The route was narrow. The Sinai Peninsula connected Africa to the Levant, but it was arid and hostile. Another possible path led across the southern end of the Red Sea, where the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb narrowed during low sea levels, perhaps to 20 kilometers, perhaps less. Imagine that crossing. You have never seen the other side. You do not know what lives there. You know only that the land behind you can no longer feed your children. So you gather what you can carry. You watch the water. You wait for low tide. And you walk, or maybe you use simple rafts. Bundles of reeds lashed together. Nothing sophisticated. Just enough to keep a few people above water long enough to reach the opposite shore. We do not know exactly how they crossed. We know only that they did. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. A small group made it across, perhaps a single band, perhaps a few hundred individuals at most. Some genetic studies suggest the entire non-African human population descends from a founding group of fewer than 1,000 people, maybe far fewer. The bottleneck within the bottleneck. Think about that for a moment. Every person alive today whose ancestry traces outside Africa may descend from a group small enough to fit inside a single modern building. Every European, every Asian, every Australian, every indigenous American, all of them traceable to this handful of desperate refugees. They did not know they were making history. They did not know they were founding civilizations that would not exist for 60,000 years. They knew only hunger. They knew only the need to keep moving. They knew only that their children needed food, and the land behind them had none. The dating is debated. Some evidence suggests waves of migration beginning as early as 120,000 years ago, but those earlier waves appear to have failed. The populations died out or were absorbed. The successful migration, the one that populated the world, likely occurred between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, right after Toba, right when things were worst. This is the paradox that haunts paleoanthropology. The greatest expansion in human history was driven not by abundance, but by scarcity. Not by strength, but by desperation. Humanity did not conquer the world. Humanity fled into it, chased by drought and cold and starvation. The first stop was the Levant. Modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. The archaeological record shows human presence here in fits and starts. Tools appear and then vanish. Campsites are occupied and then abandoned. The pattern suggests repeated attempts to establish footholds, many of which failed. But this time, something was different. This time, the migrants carried something new. Not a physical tool, not a weapon. Something harder to see in the archaeological record, but infinitely more powerful. They carried behavioral modernity, complex language, symbolic thinking, the ability to plan, to innovate, to adapt rapidly. Whether Toba caused this cognitive revolution or merely selected for it remains one of the great unanswered questions. But the humans who left Africa after 70,000 years ago were different from those who had left before. They were more flexible, more creative, more dangerous, and they needed to be. Because the lands they were entering were not empty. The Levant was a crossroads. And at that crossroads stood another human species that had called this region home for hundreds of thousands of years. They were stocky. They were strong. Their brains were as large as ours or larger. They were supremely adapted to cold climates. They were the Neanderthals. And they were not going to simply step aside. The encounter between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis is one of the most consequential meetings in the history of life on Earth. Two human species, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution, suddenly sharing the same territory, the same water sources, the same prey animals. What happened next would determine which lineage survived and which one vanished forever. But that encounter did not happen all at once. It unfolded over thousands of years, across thousands of kilometers. And before we can understand how it ended, we need to understand what the migrants found when they stepped beyond Africa for the last time. They found a world that was trying very hard to kill them. Chapter 6. A world that tried to kill us again. The land beyond Africa was beautiful. It was also lethal. The Levant during this period was a mosaic of environments. Coastal plains gave way to rugged highlands. River valleys cut through limestone plateaus. Mediterranean forests grew alongside semi-arid scrubland. For people accustomed to African coastlines, it must have seemed alien and unpredictable. The climate oscillated wildly, not over centuries, over decades, sometimes over years. The North Atlantic climate system was unstable, sending ripples of warming and cooling across Europe and Western Asia. A generation might know mild winters and abundant game. The next generation might face killing frost and empty landscapes. This is the thing about ice ages that most people do not understand. They are not uniformly cold. They are chaotic. The temperature swings back and forth. Ecosystems shift. Animal migrations change. A reliable food source one decade becomes absent the next. Stability is the exception. Volatility is the rule. For the newly arrived humans, this volatility was devastating. They had no accumulated knowledge of this land. They did not know which plants were edible and which were toxic. They did not know the migration patterns of the local animals. They did not know where water could be found in dry seasons. Everything had to be learned from scratch. And learning takes time. Time that starvation does not grant generously. The archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of struggle. Campsites are small. Tool assemblages are limited. There are signs of nutritional stress in the few skeletal remains we have found. These were not thriving communities. These were people surviving at the very edge of what was possible. And the cold kept coming. As the migrants pushed further from Africa, they encountered temperatures their ancestors had never experienced. Frost, snow, frozen rivers, winds that cut through any covering. The human body, evolved under tropical and subtropical conditions, was profoundly unsuited for these environments without technological intervention. So, they adapted. They had to. Fire became not just useful, but essential. Without fire, survival in northern latitudes during glacial periods was simply impossible. Every camp needed fire. Every night required fuel. The management of fire became the single most critical skill a human being could possess. Clothing followed. Animal hides scraped and shaped to cover the body. We do not know exactly when fitted clothing first appeared, but the genetic evidence from human body lice suggests that clothing became widespread sometime around 70,000 years ago, right when the migrations were accelerating. Coincidence seems unlikely. Shelter construction became more sophisticated. Natural caves were prized but rare. Where caves were unavailable, humans built structures from whatever materials they could find: branches, animal bones, hides stretched over frameworks. These were crude constructions by modern standards, but in a glacial landscape, they meant life. The diet had to change as well. In Africa, human diets had been diverse. Fruits, tubers, shellfish, small game, occasionally larger animals. The African landscape, even during dry periods, offered variety. But in glacial Eurasia, plant foods became scarce during winter months. Humans were forced to become more dependent on meat. This meant hunting. Serious, organized, dangerous hunting. The animals of Pleistocene Eurasia were enormous. Woolly mammoths weighing 6 tons. Woolly rhinoceroses built like armored vehicles. Giant deer with antlers spanning 3 meters. Cave bears that stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Aurochs with horns that could impale a human easily. Hunting these animals with stone-tipped spears was not just difficult. It was insane. It was the equivalent of attacking a tank with a kitchen knife. And yet humans did it. They had to. Because the alternative was starving in the dark while the wind howled outside. The injury rates were catastrophic. Neanderthal skeletons show patterns of trauma comparable to modern rodeo riders. Broken bones, crushed ribs, fractured skulls. And humans hunting the same prey suffered the same consequences. Every successful hunt came at a cost measured in blood and broken bodies. But here's where the story becomes strange. Because the same pressures that were killing people were also making the survivors more capable. Each generation that lived through a crisis carried the knowledge of that survival forward. Techniques were refined. Strategies improved. The toolkit became more sophisticated. Innovation accelerated under pressure. New weapon types appeared. The Atwa, a spear-throwing device that effectively extended the human arm, allowed hunters to strike from greater distances. Projectile points became smaller and more refined, designed for specific purposes. Fishhooks carved from bone appeared. Traps and snares supplemented active hunting. And something else was happening. Something invisible in the archaeological record, but visible in its consequences. Social networks were expanding and becoming more complex. Isolated bands could not survive long-term in these volatile environments. They needed allies. They needed trading partners. They needed genetic diversity. Exchange networks began forming. Seashells found hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Obsidian transported across mountain ranges. Ochre pigments traded between groups that never shared a campfire. These were not casual exchanges. They were lifelines. Insurance policies against local catastrophe. If your valley flooded, you could seek refuge with allies in another valley. If your hunting grounds failed, you could access shared territories. If your band became too small to sustain itself genetically, you could find mates among allied groups. Connection meant survival. Isolation meant extinction. This is the pattern that repeats throughout this entire period. Every crisis forced adaptation. Every adaptation enabled expansion. Every expansion brought new crises. The cycle was relentless, and it was accelerating. But there was one crisis that no amount of innovation could easily solve. The other humans. As Homo sapiens pushed deeper into Eurasia, they increasingly encountered Neanderthals in the west and Denisovans in the east. These were not animals. These were intelligent beings with their own tools, their own fire, their own social structures, their own burial practices. The Neanderthals in particular were formidable. They had survived in Europe through multiple glacial cycles spanning over 300,000 years. They knew the land intimately. They were physically stronger than Homo sapiens. Their brains were at least as large. They were not primitive. They were specialists. So what happened when these species met? The answer is complicated, and it is not what most people expect. There was violence, almost certainly. Competition for territory and resources between closely related species almost always involves conflict. Archaeological evidence is sparse, but suggestive. Some Neanderthal sites show signs of abrupt abandonment. Some human sites show defensive positioning. But there was also something else. Something that shocked the scientific community when it was first confirmed in 2010 through ancient DNA analysis. There was interbreeding. Neanderthal DNA exists in modern humans. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of every person of non-African descent comes from Neanderthals. Denisovan DNA persists as well, particularly in Melanesian and Australian Aboriginal populations, sometimes comprising up to 6% of their genomes. These were not rare events. They happened repeatedly over thousands of years. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together. Those children survived and reproduced. Their genes spread through the growing human population and persist today in billions of people. This changes everything about how we understand this period. It was not a simple story of one species replacing another. It was a story of contact, conflict, coexistence, and genetic exchange. The boundaries between species were blurrier than anyone had imagined, but the outcome was still asymmetric. Homo sapiens expanded, Neanderthals contracted. Denisovans vanished. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were confined to shrinking refugia in southern Europe. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone. The last known Neanderthal population survived in Gibraltar and perhaps a few Mediterranean islands. Then silence. What killed them? Was it direct competition? Climate change? Disease carried by the newcomers? Demographic pressure from larger sapiens populations? Absorption through interbreeding into the genetically dominant sapiens genome? Probably all of these. Probably no single cause. Probably a slow grinding attrition played out over 15,000 years across an entire continent. Not a war. Not a genocide. Just one species slightly more adaptable than another in a world that punished every weakness with extinction. And here is the haunting thought that should keep you awake tonight. It could easily have gone the other way. There was nothing inevitable about our survival. The Neanderthals were smart. They were tough. They had 300,000 years of experience in exactly these conditions. If the climate had shifted differently, if a disease had struck our ancestors instead, if one critical battle had gone the other way, you might never have existed, and something else might be reading these words instead. But our ancestors did survive. Battered and diminished and forever changed by what they had absorbed from their cousins, they pushed forward, into Europe, across Central Asia, down into Southeast Asia, toward Australia, into lands no human of any species had ever seen. And then the Ice Age tightened its grip one final time. Chapter 7. The Ice Age that never let go. Around 26,000 years ago, the world began to freeze in earnest. The period known as the last glacial maximum was approaching. It would peak between 26,500 and 19,000 years ago, and it would push humanity closer to extinction than anything since Toba. Not through a single catastrophic event. Through slow, relentless, grinding cold. Ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada and extended deep into what is now the northern United States. In Europe, the Scandinavian ice sheet buried everything from Scotland to northern Russia under kilometers of ice. These were not abstract geological features. They were walls. Walls of ice 3 kilometers high in some places. They ground the earth beneath them flat. They diverted rivers. They created lakes the size of small seas. They changed wind patterns across the entire planet. Global sea levels dropped by approximately 120 meters. Coastlines extended outward by hundreds of kilometers in some regions. Land bridges appeared. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia to North America. Britain was connected to continental Europe. Australia was connected to New Guinea and Tasmania. The world map was unrecognizable. And the cold was extraordinary. Average global temperatures were roughly 6 degrees Celsius lower than today. In the northern latitudes, winter temperatures in regions humans occupied could drop to -40, -50. Cold that kills exposed flesh in minutes. Cold that turned survival into a full-time occupation. Forests retreated. The vast forests that had covered much of Europe shrank to isolated pockets in southern refugia around the Mediterranean, in the Balkans, and in the Iberian and Italian peninsulas. In their place spread enormous treeless steppes, cold grasslands stretching from France to Siberia without interruption. This was the mammoth steppe, the largest biome on Earth at the time, an ecosystem unlike anything that exists today. Grasslands supporting enormous herds of woolly mammoths, horses, bison, reindeer, and musk oxen. A cold Serengeti, productive but brutally demanding for any predator trying to exploit it. Humans lived on the mammoth steppe. But living is perhaps too generous a word. They existed on it. They endured it. Population densities were extraordinarily low. Archaeological surveys suggest that at the height of the glacial maximum, the entire population of Europe may have numbered only a few tens of thousands. Some estimates are even lower. Perhaps as few as several thousand people scattered across a continent. Entire regions were abandoned. Northern Europe was empty. Central Europe was largely empty. Britain was empty. Scandinavia was buried under ice. Even southern France, where some of the richest archaeological sites from this period are found, supported only sparse, scattered populations concentrated in river valleys and cave systems. The caves became everything. The limestone caves of southern France and northern Spain became the most critical real estate in the human world. They offered shelter from wind and cold. They maintained relatively stable temperatures year-round. They could be defended. They could be heated with fire. They were the difference between living and dying. And inside those caves, something extraordinary happened. Humans began painting. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, and dozens of other sites represent some of the most stunning artistic achievements in human history. Animals rendered with breathtaking skill and sensitivity. Horses galloping across stone walls. Bison turning their massive heads. Lions stalking in procession. Mammoths drawn with such accuracy that paleontologists use them as anatomical references. Why would people on the edge of extinction create art? This question has haunted researchers for over a century. The paintings were not decorative. They were placed deep inside caves, often in chambers that required crawling through narrow passages in total darkness to reach. They were not meant to be seen casually. They were meant for something else entirely. Ritual, magic, communication with the spirit world, teaching, memory. We do not know for certain, but we know this. The creation of art in the depths of the worst ice age demonstrates something profound about the human mind under pressure. It does not merely survive. It reaches for meaning. Even when dying, especially when dying, humans insist on making sense of the world. They insist on beauty. They insist on story. And that insistence may be exactly what kept them alive when everything else was trying to kill them. But art alone does not feed children. The practical technologies of this period were equally remarkable. Bone needles appeared, enabling the construction of truly fitted clothing with sewn seams. This was not a minor innovation. Fitted clothing with sealed seams is dramatically more effective at retaining body heat than draped hides. It was survival engineering. Houses were built from mammoth bones. At sites like Mazyrik in Ukraine, Archaeologists have found structures constructed from hundreds of mammoth bones and tusks arranged into dome-shaped dwellings. These were not temporary camps. They were permanent settlements, homes built from the skeletons of giants. Storage technologies improved. Meat could be frozen naturally in the glacial cold, creating reserves for the worst periods. Pits lined with permafrost functioned as natural freezers. For the first time, humans could stockpile significant food reserves, buffering against the deadly unpredictability of hunting in glacial conditions. But the cold still won more often than not. Genetic evidence reveals repeated population crashes during the last glacial maximum. Lineages appear and vanish. Populations contract into refugia and then cautiously expand. The pattern is one of constant retreat and tentative recovery. 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And the isolation was devastating. Small populations trapped in scattered refugia for thousands of years developed distinct genetic signatures. The major population groups that would later be characterized as different in appearance were being shaped during this period. Not by choice, not by design. By ice, by mountains, by deserts, by distance. The groups that survived in the Iberian refugium developed differently from those in the Balkans. The populations in Central Asia diverged from those in Southeast Asia. The people who had reached Australia 45,000 years ago were completely cut off from everyone else and had been evolving independently for millennia. Humanity was fragmenting, not because of conflict, because of climate. The ice was sorting people into separate boxes and sealing the lids. Communication between groups became difficult or impossible. Trade networks that had sustained populations during less severe periods broke down. The exchange of genes, ideas, and technologies that had driven innovation slowed to a trickle. Each isolated group had to solve the problem of survival on its own. Some did not solve it. We know of populations that simply vanished during this period, archaeological sequences that go silent, genetic lineages that dead-end, cultures that produce beautiful tools and complex social structures and then disappeared without any descendants, not conquered, not absorbed, simply erased by the cold and the hunger. The loss is incalculable. How many languages died unheard? How many innovations were made and then lost when the last person who knew them starved? How many solutions to the problem of being human were developed in some frozen valley and then buried under ice forever? We will never know. The ice keeps its secrets. And for those who survived, the psychological toll must have been enormous. Imagine living your entire life in a world that is visibly dying, where the glaciers are always visible on the horizon, creeping closer, where the elders remember forests that are now frozen plains, where every winter might be the one that finally wins. Hope must have been the most precious and most fragile resource of all. Yet they held on. Through generation after generation of cold and darkness and loss, they held on. They told stories by firelight. They painted animals on cave walls in the dark. They sewed clothing with bone needles. They built homes from the bones of extinct giants. They refused to disappear. But the last glacial maximum was not the final test, not even close, because around 19,000 years ago, something began to change. The ice started retreating. Temperatures began rising, slowly, erratically, with false starts and sudden reversals. But the trend was unmistakable. The world was warming. And you might think that would be good news. You would be wrong, because the warming unleashed catastrophes that made the cold look almost gentle by comparison. Meltwater from the collapsing ice sheets poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose rapidly, sometimes meters within a single human lifetime. Coastlines that had been home to communities for thousands of years drowned. The land bridges that had connected continents began to flood. Communities that had maintained tenuous contact were severed permanently. Ecosystems that had been stable for millennia transformed within generations. The mammoth steppe, That vast productive grassland began to fragment and eventually would vanish entirely. The megafauna started dying, not just declining, disappearing. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears. Species after species that had survived millions of years of ice ages suddenly collapsed within a few thousand years. Whether humans hunted them to extinction or climate change destroyed their habitat or both remains fiercely debated. But the result was the same. The world that humanity had learned to survive in was dissolving. Every adaptation, every technology, every strategy that had been developed over 30,000 years of glacial survival was becoming obsolete. The rules were changing again, and they were changing fast. The survivors of the Ice Age now faced something arguably worse than the cold. They faced a world in chaos, a world where nothing was stable, where the familiar was disappearing and the unknown was rushing in to replace it, where the skills your parents taught you might be useless by the time you taught them to your children. And somewhere in this chaos, in this narrow window between the dying Ice Age and the emerging modern world, humanity would face its most consequential transformation. Not biological, not genetic, cultural. Something was about to happen that would change the trajectory of our species more profoundly than Toba, more profoundly than the Ice Age, more profoundly than the encounter with the Neanderthals. Something that would make everything that came before look like a prologue. But to understand what happened next, you first need to understand what was happening in one specific region. A crescent-shaped strip of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria and down to the eastern Mediterranean coast. A place that would later be called the Fertile Crescent. A place where starving, desperate Ice Age survivors were about to accidentally invent the future. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Chapter 8. When the climate snapped back, you thought the worst was over. The ice was retreating. The world was warming. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, the future looked like something worth walking toward. Rivers swelled with meltwater. Forests crept north across landscapes scoured clean by glaciers. People noticed. Of course they noticed. They had survived the worst cold snap their species had ever endured. They had hunted mammoths across frozen steppes. They had sewn clothing from animal hides using bone needles so fine they could thread sinew through leather. Now the world was opening up. New lands, new plants, new animals moving into territories that had been locked under ice for millennia. Human populations began expanding again, pushing into regions their ancestors had abandoned generations earlier. Hope is a dangerous thing. Around 14,700 years ago, temperatures spiked dramatically in what scientists call the bullying Allard warming. In parts of the northern hemisphere, average temperatures jumped several degrees in just decades. Ice sheets that had dominated the landscape began their long groaning retreat northward. This was not gentle. Meltwater poured off continental ice sheets in volumes difficult to comprehend. Ancient lakes formed behind ice dams, growing larger and more unstable with each passing year. The world was literally reshaping itself, coastlines moving, rivers rerouting, entire ecosystems migrating. Humans adapted as they always had. Populations in Europe expanded out of their glacial refugia in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. In the Levant and across southwestern Asia, communities grew larger and more complex. Some groups began experimenting with something unprecedented. They started managing wild plants, not farming, not yet, but tending, encouraging, returning to the same patches of wild wheat and barley season after season, building small permanent structures near reliable water sources, storing food, settling down, even if just for parts of the year. This was the Natufian culture, emerging around 15,000 to 11,500 years ago in the eastern Mediterranean. They built villages. They ground grain on stone mortar. They buried their dead with elaborate care. They kept dogs. They were on the edge of something transformative. And then the climate snapped back. Around 12,900 years ago, with almost no warning, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged. Not gradually, not over centuries, in perhaps a single decade, maybe less. The cold returned with a brutality that seemed almost personal, almost targeted. This was the Younger Dryas, named after a small white flower, Dryas octopetala, that thrives in cold tundra conditions and whose pollen suddenly reappeared in European sediment cores dating to this period. A pretty name for an ugly catastrophe. The leading theory involves Lake Agassiz, an enormous body of glacial meltwater covering much of central Canada. As ice dams failed, a massive pulse of fresh water may have flooded into the North Atlantic, disrupting the thermaline circulation that carries warm water northward. Think of it as switching off the Gulf Stream. Europe lost its heating system. Temperatures dropped 8 to 15 degrees Celsius in parts of the North Atlantic region. Glaciers advanced again. Forests retreated. The tundra came back, that white flower blooming where trees had stood. This happened fast, within a human lifetime, possibly within a single decade. Imagine being born into a warming world, watching forests grow, watching your community settle and build, watching abundance return, then watching it all reverse before you are old enough to have grandchildren. The Younger Dryas lasted approximately 1,200 years, from roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. Over 1,000 years of renewed cold, drought in many regions, ecological disruption on a continental scale. It was not as severe as the last glacial maximum, but it was arguably crueler. Crueler because of the timing. Humans had begun to invest in sedentary living. They had begun to depend on specific plants in specific places. They had started building permanent homes and developing social structures tied to fixed locations. The cold did not care about any of that. In the Levant, Nachafian villages show evidence of stress during this period. Some communities shrank. Some were abandoned entirely. Dietary evidence from bones and teeth shows increased reliance on lower quality foods. People were hungry again. People were moving again. The old desperate wandering resumed. But here's what makes this different from every previous catastrophe. Some communities did not abandon their settlements. Some stayed. Some doubled down. And in that stubborn, desperate refusal to go back to the old ways, something irreversible was born. When your wild grain patches fail because the rains have stopped, you have two choices. You can leave and follow the food, as your ancestors did for 200,000 years. Or you can try to make the food come to you. You can plant seeds deliberately. This is not innovation born from curiosity. This is not a genius having a revelation beside a wheat field. This is a starving community with permanent structures they refuse to abandon, watching their wild food sources disappear, making a desperate gamble that they can control what grows and where. The archaeological site of Abu Huraira in modern Syria tells this story with heartbreaking clarity. During the Younger Dryas, the wild plants that sustained the community disappeared from the record one by one, and then cultivated varieties appeared. Rye first, then wheat, then lentils. They did not choose farming. Farming chose them. Or rather, catastrophe chose farming for them. The Younger Dryas, that cruel reversal, that slap from a climate that seemed to be done punishing humanity, may have been the specific pressure that forced the invention of agriculture. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Some researchers argue that agriculture was already developing before the Younger Dryas, that the trajectory was set during the warmer Bulling-Allard period. The cold snap may have accelerated an existing trend rather than creating something entirely new. But the timing is difficult to dismiss. Across the Fertile Crescent, the earliest clear evidence of deliberate cultivation clusters around the end of the Younger Dryas and the centuries immediately following it. The pattern repeats. Catastrophe, bottleneck, desperate innovation, transformation. You know this pattern by now. The Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures surged upward again. Ice cores from Greenland show the transition happening in as little as 1 to 3 years. The climate flipped like a switch from glacial conditions to something resembling the modern world. This marks the beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch we still technically inhabit. The stable, warm, unusually predictable climate period that enabled everything we call civilization, farming, cities, writing, empires, industry, technology, all of it built on a narrow platform of climatic stability. But the humans who entered the Holocene were not the same species that had entered the Younger Dryas. They carried scars, genetic, cultural, psychological scars. They had learned, at the deepest level, that the world could not be trusted. That warmth was temporary. That abundance was a lie. And they carried something else, seeds, actual seeds, and the knowledge of how to put them in the ground and make them grow. They carried the embryo of agriculture, conceived in desperation, born in crisis, destined to remake the entire surface of the earth. They did not know what they were carrying. They did not know that this desperate survival strategy would become a trap. They did not know that the solution to one catastrophe would become the foundation for entirely new categories of suffering. They were just trying to survive another winter. The flower that gave the Younger Dryas its name still blooms in cold places. White petals, hardy roots. It thrives where nothing else will grow. There is something fitting about that. The worst times produce the toughest adaptations. But toughness and wisdom are not the same thing. The climate had snapped back, and humanity had snapped forward, into a future none of them could have imagined, into a trap none of them could have recognized, into the world we inherited, built on 10,000 years of consequences flowing from choices made by starving people who just wanted to eat tomorrow. Chapter 9. The end that looked like a beginning. The Holocene arrived like a door opening into a warm room. After 12,900 years of the Younger Dryas cold snap, after millennia of glacial brutality before that, the climate stabilized into something remarkably gentle. Predictable seasons, reliable rainfall, temperatures that stayed within a narrow, hospitable range. This was the world agriculture had been waiting for. Not that agriculture was waiting. Agriculture was an accident, a desperate improvisation by starving communities. But the Holocene provided the conditions under which that desperate improvisation could actually work, could scale, could spread, could become permanent and inescapable. The Fertile Crescent earned its name. That arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria, curving down through Lebanon and Israel to the borders of Egypt. Rich soils, adequate water, wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and flax all growing naturally. Within a few thousand years of the Holocene's beginning, farming communities dotted this landscape. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements, dates to approximately 11,000 years ago. Catalyuk in modern Turkey, a dense settlement of thousands, flourished around 9,000 years ago. Permanent, packed, transforming. And here's the paradox that defines everything that follows. Agriculture was the greatest survival innovation in human history. And agriculture was the worst thing that ever happened to the human body, to human equality, to human freedom, and possibly to the human mind. Start with the body. Skeletal evidence from the transition period tells a stark story. Hunter-gatherers were taller, stronger, and healthier than early farmers. Their bones show fewer signs of nutritional stress. Their teeth were better. Their joints showed less repetitive strain. They ate more diverse diets. Early farmers shrank, literally. Average height declined measurably in populations that adopted agriculture. Dental cavities exploded because grain-heavy diets bathed teeth in sugars they had never evolved to handle. Bone density decreased. Evidence of anemia increased. Arthritis appeared in younger individuals from repetitive grinding and harvesting. The diet narrowed catastrophically. Hunter-gatherers consumed dozens or hundreds of different plant and animal species, depending on season and location. Early farmers depended on a handful of staple crops. When those crops failed, there was no fallback. No diverse portfolio of wild foods to exploit. Famine became possible in ways it had never been before. A hunter-gatherer band facing local food scarcity could move. A farming community with permanent structures, stored grain, and cleared fields could not. They were anchored, rooted, dependent on rain falling in the right amounts at the right times. And the diseases. This is where the story becomes truly cruel. Dense permanent settlements created conditions for epidemic disease that had never existed in human history. Thousands of people living in close proximity to each other and to their domesticated animals, sharing water sources, accumulating waste. Measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza, nearly every major epidemic disease in human history originated in the transition to agricultural living, jumping from domesticated animals to human hosts in crowded settlements with poor sanitation. The plagues that would later devastate civilizations were born in these first villages. Hunter-gatherers rarely experienced epidemics. Their bands were too small, too mobile, too dispersed. Pathogens could not sustain transmission chains in populations of 30 or 50 people who moved camp every few weeks. Farming created the perfect breeding ground for infectious disease, permanently. Then there is the question of equality. This one cuts deep. Archaeological evidence from hunter-gatherer societies shows remarkable egalitarianism. Burials are similar in their simplicity. Shelters are roughly equivalent. Food sharing was the norm. No one accumulated significantly more than anyone else. Agriculture changed that immediately and irreversibly. Stored grain is wealth. Wealth can be accumulated. Accumulated wealth creates hierarchy. Within a few generations of adopting farming, settlements show clear evidence of social stratification. Some burials are elaborate with grave goods. Others are bare. The gap was born. Land ownership followed. If your survival depends on a specific plot of ground you have cleared and planted, that ground becomes yours in a way that no hunter-gatherer territory ever was. Property, inheritance, the ability to pass accumulated advantage from one generation to the next. With property came the need to defend it. With defense came organized violence on a scale hunter-gatherers had never practiced. Walls appeared. Weapon stockpiles appeared. Evidence of large-scale violent conflict appears in the archaeological record almost immediately after the appearance of permanent agricultural settlements. War was invented. And slavery. When your economic system depends on labor-intensive grain cultivation and you have a permanent settlement to defend, captured enemies become a resource rather than a threat to be driven away. The earliest evidence of systematic forced labor correlates directly with the spread of agriculture. Jared Diamond called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. That phrase has been debated endlessly, but the evidence supporting it is substantial and disturbing. By almost every measure of individual human well-being, the transition to farming made life worse for most people. So why did it spread? Why did farming replace hunting and gathering across most of the world if it made people shorter, sicker, hungrier, more unequal, and more violent? The answer is brutally simple. Farming populations grew faster, not healthier, not happier, just more numerous. A woman in a sedentary farming community could bear children more frequently than a nomadic hunter-gatherer woman. Shorter intervals between births. More surviving infants despite higher disease rates because grain could be processed into weaning foods. Farming communities simply outbred their hunter-gatherer neighbors. And then they displaced them through sheer numbers. through territorial expansion driven by growing populations needing more farmland, through violence enabled by larger, denser, better organized communities, through disease, as farming populations carried pathogens their hunter-gatherer neighbors had no immunity to resist. This is not progress. This is a ratchet. Each step forward in food production enabled population growth that made the previous way of life impossible to return to. Too many mouths to feed by hunting and gathering. Too much investment in cleared land and stored grain to abandon. The trap closed slowly, generation by generation. No single person chose it. No single community could see it happening. By the time farming was established, going back was impossible. The population had grown beyond what the land could support through foraging. Agriculture was no longer a choice. It was a sentence. Within 5,000 years of the Holocene's beginning, farming had spread from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, North Africa, and South Asia. Independent invention of agriculture occurred in China with rice and millet, in Mesoamerica with maize and squash, in the Andes with potatoes, in sub-Saharan Africa with sorghum. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Sedentary communities, population growth, social stratification, disease, organized violence, environmental degradation as forests were cleared, soils were depleted, and waterways were altered. The same trap sprung independently across the globe, driven by the same implacable arithmetic of human reproduction. The first cities emerged from this process. Uruk in Mesopotamia, possibly the first true city, reached populations of 40,000 or more by 3100 BCE. With cities came writing, invented primarily to track grain stores and tax obligations. The first written words were not poetry. They were receipts. Bureaucracy, taxation, centralized authority, standing armies, priesthoods, kingship. Every institution we associate with civilization grew directly from the agricultural surplus and the social complexity it enabled. None of it was planned. All of it was emergent. All of it was rooted in that desperate decision to plant seeds. The people who watched the younger Dryas destroy their wild food sources and responded by pushing seeds into the ground could not have imagined Uruk, could not have imagined writing or taxation or standing armies or empires. They were solving an immediate problem, survival until next season. But their solution echoed forward through 10,000 years. Every empire, every war, every plague, every famine, every revolution, every institution, every inequality you have ever read about traces its roots back to that moment. To starving people in the Fertile Crescent choosing to plant rather than to walk. The end that looked like a beginning. The solution that became the problem. The escape from one catastrophe that built the architecture for every catastrophe that followed. This is the story of our species. Not triumph. Not progress. Survival. Desperate, imperfect, consequential survival. And we are still living in the consequences. Every single day, every bite of bread, every property line, every border, every war over resources, every epidemic that sweeps through our dense, interconnected agricultural world. We are still inside the trap that closed 12,000 years ago. The question is not whether the trap was worth it. That question is meaningless. No one chose it. No one could have foreseen it. The question that matters is simpler and more unsettling. Can we recognize a trap while we are inside it? Chapter 10. The trap we still live in you are alive. That fact alone is statistically absurd. Trace your lineage back through the centuries and the millennia, past every plague, every famine, every war, every natural disaster, every random accident that could have severed the chain. Go back further, past the agricultural revolution and its diseases, past the younger Dryas, past the last glacial maximum, when perhaps only tens of thousands of humans huddled in scattered refugia across a frozen world, past the failed migrations out of Africa, past the desperate crossing of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait by fewer than 1,000 people. Go all the way back to Toba, 74,000 years ago, a volcano that nearly ended everything. A breeding population that may have fallen below 10,000. A species balanced on the thinnest possible edge between existence and oblivion. Your ancestors were there. Every single one of them survived. This is not inspiration. This is not a motivational speech about human resilience. This is a forensic examination of what that survival cost and what it built and what it means that you're reading. These words right now in a world shaped entirely by catastrophe. Start with your body. Your genome carries the evidence. Human beings are among the most genetically uniform large mammals on Earth. 2 chimpanzees from the same forest in Central Africa are more genetically different from each other than any 2 humans chosen at random from anywhere on the planet. This is Toba's signature, written into every cell you carry. The bottleneck compressed our genetic diversity so severely that 74,000 years later, we still have not recovered the variation that existed before the eruption. You are living proof of a near-extinction event. Your DNA is a scar. But the scars go deeper than genetics. Consider your psychology. Humans are uniquely anxious animals. We worry about the future in ways no other species appears to. We plan obsessively. We hoard. We build surplus beyond any immediate need. We catastrophize. Evolutionary psychologists have long noted that human cognition seems calibrated for threat detection far beyond what our current environment demands. We see danger everywhere. We overestimate risk. We respond to uncertainty with visceral dread that seems wildly disproportionate to the actual threats we face. What if that is not a bug? What if that is the Toba legacy? What if 74,000 years of repeated catastrophe, bottleneck, near extinction, ice age, climate reversal, famine, and plague, selected specifically for most anxious, most paranoid, most obsessively future-oriented individuals? What if worry is what survived? The people who were calm did not make it. The people who trusted abundance did not make it. The people who lived in the present moment without knowing anxiety about tomorrow did not make it. The warriors made it. The hoarders made it. The ones who could not stop planning made it. You are descended from the most anxious humans who ever lived. Every generation, the calm ones were slightly more likely to die. Every bottleneck, every famine, every catastrophe pruned the population toward hypervigilance, toward distrust of stability, toward the deep, unshakable conviction that disaster is always coming. This explains more about the modern world than any political theory or economic model ever could. Why do we overconsume? Because our ancestors who stored more survived. Why do we struggle with contentment? Because contentment was lethal for 100,000 years. Why does anxiety feel so natural? Because it is natural. It is the most natural thing about you. It was selected for, reinforced, and refined across thousands of generations of catastrophe. Your anxiety is not a disorder. It is an inheritance. The most successful survival strategy your species ever developed, still running in an environment that no longer requires it. Now consider the social structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities, the concentrations of power and wealth that define every civilization that has ever existed. These are not inevitable features of intelligent life. They are specific consequences of the agricultural trap, which was itself a consequence of the Younger Dryas, which was itself a consequence of the post-glacial climate instability, which was itself a consequence of the ice ages, which overlapped with and compounded the Toba bottleneck. Pull the thread far enough, and every structure of modern civilization connects back to specific catastrophes that force specific desperate adaptations. This is the revelation that has been building across this entire narrative. The central question was simple. What was it like to be born during the worst period in human history? But the answer is not what you expected. The answer is that the worst period never ended. You are still living in it. not the ice, not the volcanic winter, not the literal starvation and freezing, but the structures built by the survivors, the psychology shaped by the bottlenecks, the social systems forced into existence by the agricultural trap, the anxiety inherited from 100,000 years of nearly dying. Every institution you interact with daily exists because starving people made desperate choices that echoed forward through millennia. Every worry that keeps you awake at night is the ghost of an ancestor who survived because they could not stop worrying. Every inequality you witness is the descendant of the first stored grain. The trap is not just agriculture. The trap is the entire cascade. Toba created the bottleneck that shaped our psychology. The Ice Ages created the pressures that drove migration. The Younger Dryas created the desperation that birthed farming. Farming created the surplus that enabled hierarchy. Hierarchy created civilization. And civilization created you. Anxious, unequal, overcrowded, disease-prone, environmentally destructive, brilliant, creative, technological you. Every gift and every curse wrapped together in a species that nearly went extinct and spent the next 74,000 years overcompensating in ways that reshaped an entire planet. This is not a tragedy. That framing is too simple. And it is not a triumph. That framing is dishonest. It is something more complicated and more interesting than either. It is a consequence. An unbroken chain of consequences stretching from a supervolcano in Sumatra to the device you are using right now. The people at Pinnacle Point, cracking shellfish on the rocks of southern Africa, while ash darkened the sky, could not have imagined you. Could not have imagined cities or smartphones or space stations. But every choice they made, every child they raised, every season they survived, built the path you stand on. You are not separate from that story. You are not reading about ancient history. You are reading about the forces that shaped your mind, your body, your society, and your deepest instincts. The Toba bottleneck is not 74,000 years behind you. It is in your cells. It is in your thoughts. So what do you do with that knowledge? That is the open question. The one this narrative cannot answer because it is not a historical question. It is a present tense question. A question about what happens when a species shaped by catastrophe finally has the awareness to recognize what shaped it. We can see the trap now. For the first time in 74,000 years, we have the scientific tools to reconstruct the story. Genetics, archaeology, climate science, paleoanthropology. We can trace the chain of causation from Toba to this moment. We can name the forces that built us. But naming a trap and escaping it are different things entirely. We are still running the anxiety software installed by 10,000 generations of catastrophe. Still building hierarchies rooted in agricultural surplus. Still consuming as though famine is one season away. Still treating the planet the way desperate survivors treat a temporary camp. The question that haunts every page of this story is whether awareness changes anything. Whether knowing that your anxiety is inherited rather than rational makes it easier to bear. Whether understanding that inequality is constructed rather than natural makes it easier to dismantle. Whether seeing the trap means you can escape it. Or whether we are simply the latest generation of survivors, doing what survivors do. Hoarding, building, worrying, consuming, preparing for the next catastrophe with the same desperate energy that carried our species through every previous one. Unable to stop because stopping was never an option that survived. There is one more thing the evidence shows. One detail that complicates the despair. At every single bottleneck and every single near-extinction event, the thing that saved us was not individual strength. It was not aggression. It was not dominance. It was cooperation. It was each other. The bands that survived Toba shared food. The communities that survived the Ice Ages shared knowledge. The groups that crossed out of Africa shared stories, tools, fire, and hope. The villages that survived the Younger Dryas shared seeds. At every breaking point, The survivors were the ones who held together. That is also in your inheritance, alongside the anxiety and the hoarding and the hierarchy. Deep in the same genome that carries Toba's scar is the capacity for extraordinary cooperation, for empathy, for sacrifice, for choosing the group over the self when the stakes are absolute. The worst period in human history did not produce a species defined by selfishness. It produced a species defined by tension, between fear and cooperation, between hoarding and sharing, between building walls and building bridges. The catastrophe is in us, but so is the response to catastrophe. 74,000 years ago, a volcano tried to end humanity. It failed, not because humans were strong, because humans were together. That is the oldest story we carry, older than language, older than art, older than agriculture or civilization or any structure we have built. And it is still the only story that matters. There is a flower that grows in the coldest places on Earth. White petals, close to the ground, roots gripping thin soil over permafrost, Dryas octopetala. The same flower that gave its name to the younger Dryas, that brutal climate reversal that almost broke humanity for the last time. It is still blooming. In the Arctic, in the high mountains, in places where almost nothing else survives. It does not bloom because conditions are favorable. It blooms because it adapted to conditions that would kill nearly anything else. It is not thriving, it is persisting. There is a difference. You are the human equivalent of that flower, not thriving because the world is kind, persisting because your ancestors adapted to conditions that killed nearly everything else. Your anxiety is a root system gripping thin soil. Your cooperation is a white petal opening in frozen air. 74,000 years of catastrophe did not make you fragile. It made you this: complicated, contradictory, scarred in your very DNA, carrying the imprint of every disaster, every bottleneck, every desperate innovation, every moment when a small group of starving people chose to share food instead of fight over it. The question is not where we came from. That story is written in ice cores and ash layers and ancient genomes. The question is what we do now that we can read the story, now that we know the trap exists, now that we understand that the anxiety whispering in our ears is an echo from Toba. You have spent this time following a thread from a supervolcano to the present moment. That thread does not end here. It runs forward into whatever comes next, the next catastrophe, the next adaptation, the next desperate choice that will echo for millennia. The thread runs through you now. The worst time in human history to be born lasted 62,000 years. And the species that survived, it is still deciding what survival means. If this story changed how you see yourself, even slightly, then subscribe to our channel. More stories like this are coming. Stories about who we were, who we are, and who we might yet become. The ash settled long ago. What grows from it is still up to us.